Hi there, and welcome to this webinar on psychological safety for virtual teams. Now, we originally recorded this webinar a few days ago for Fresh Minds, who are a leading resourcing and consulting firm. We recorded this webinar with a number of participants on the call, but what we wanted to do is we wanted to create an environment of psychological safety for them. So we decided actually not to record the webinar at all. So what we're trying to do in this webinar is to give you some of the content that we shared, but in a sort of a bite-sized format. So we hope to be doing this session in about 30 minutes this time around. So welcome to the session. I'm going to say a few words about Mannaz, and I'm going to also introduce myself, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Terry to say a few words about herself as well. So I work for a consulting firm called Mannaz, and we're leaders in leadership development. We're based in Copenhagen. That's where our head offices are, but we have offices throughout Europe. Now, we have an office in London, but today I'm speaking to you from my spare room as we're currently in lockdown. So hopefully this won't impact this workshop for you in any way whatsoever. I'll give you a quick introduction to me. My name is Stuart Schofield. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist. So my background is in psychology, and I've been working in leadership development for about 25 years now. And I'll hand over to Terry.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I'm Terry McBride, and as you can hear from my accent, I am American. That being said, I'm also BBC British by choice, and I've been working in London for the past 13 years. For about the past 20 years, I've worked as a management consultant and an executive coach, focusing on individual and organization effectiveness, so really driving home the business impact of leadership development.
Thank you, Terry. And this is really what we wanted to cover in the next half an hour. So we've got a number of things to look at. So we wanted to quickly start by asking ourselves the question, what is psychological safety? So we'll be giving you a definition of that. We're going to talk about the importance of psychological safety, not just for me, myself, and my own enjoyment of work, but also for the team and its ability to do good work, but also for the organization as well, and how we create a culture of psychological safety within the organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about how psychological safety impacts organizations, and we've got a few stories to tell you there. And we're going to finish off this session by giving you 5 tips on how you might create psychological safety with your teams. So that's really what we wanted to do. Now, when we started our session a few days ago with our participants, we thought we would start with a little experiment. Now, our intent here was to break the ice a little bit for the group and to create a psychologically safe environment for these participants who'd called into this webinar. So we thought we would break the ice in the following way. Now, I showed a picture of some rabbits, and well, if you're ever asked for your favorite book, you might say something by Atwell or Steinbeck. You may even say something by Chaucer, but my favorite book actually is Watership Down, and it's been a favorite of mine ever since I was a little boy. And in fact, I really love the film as well. Now, the reason I share this is purely just to create a sense of a safety within this webinar session. And so what we thought we would do is we would also get other participants to take part. So we asked them if they could name a short film or a song that they liked, but well, they knew they shouldn't like, but they actually did. And we watched our chat fill up with various suggestions. And I think the most popular film was Dirty Dancing. Taylor Swift came up quite a lot as well. And it was great just watching these suggestions come up. Now, of course, we did this to break the ice a little bit and to get people feeling a little bit more comfortable. But there was a greater point in being able to share this stuff. We wanted people to feel that this was an environment, this webinar was an environment in which they could feel comfortable speaking up, that they could feel comfortable taking interpersonal risks with each other, that they could perhaps show a little bit more of their authentic selves. So that's one of the reasons why we did it. And another reason for doing it is just to give people an example of something that they might want to do in their webinars. Now that we're in this crazy virtual world, are there things that you can do with your teams that might help create psychological safety early on in the discussion? So this was an example of that.
And one of the interesting things that came out of it is even in this very low risk environment where people didn't know each other, it was fairly free of judgment. And many people were never going to see each other ever again. And such an innocuous question of what is your guilty film or guilty song, people self-censored. So you could see the lag of people starting to read what other people have written, and then almost the admission of, oh, you like ABBA? I like ABBA too. But what's so interesting is if we're self-censoring in a virtual environment that is so incredibly low risk, imagine the business impact when we self-censor at work.
Yeah. This is an example of one of the exercises you might do in your virtual environment. I'll give you an example of one of the exercises that we do when we're running our own leadership programs. We have participants group into pairs, and we get them to do portraits of each other very quickly on a piece of blank paper. And what's interesting is you watch people as they draw these portraits, and they immediately give you nervous laughter or immediately apologize for the work that they're doing. And it always makes me think, well, children don't apologize. Children don't apologize. If you're working from home, you would have seen your children a lot over the last few days, and they would have been running up to you with the latest painting that they have or the drawing that they've done, and they're very proud of it. And I wonder what happens to us as we sort of enter from childhood into adulthood. Why do we self-censor so much? Why do we stop being as authentic as we are as when we're children? So this is really talking about psychological safety from a very personal point of view. But let's just think about what this means for us in terms of the modern work and the unique circumstances in which we find ourselves, not just in this COVID-19 environment today, but also in the general business environment that we find ourselves in anyway. I'm reminded of this piece of work that was done by Google, where they asked their team members for the best predictors of team success. And one of the items that kept coming up was, I feel safe expressing divergent opinions to the team. Now, team members who said yes to that often found themselves working in teams that had fantastic productivity, fantastic return on investment. And also these teams were teams that stayed together, and there was increased engagement and retention from those teams as well. So when a leader is able to make you feel safe, great things can happen. But we can talk about this at the macro level as well. And Terry, I'll hand over to you here just to talk us through this slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So on a normal basis, we all experience the pressures that are outlined here, whether it's ambiguity and complexity, the need for creative thinking, the need to reduce barriers to communication, and to have more employee engagement, belonging, and ultimately retention. But over the past few weeks and months, what really has come to the fore for many of our clients is the need to navigate this greater macro and micro uncertainty, the need to push through these obstacles and create this safe container to really drive the creative thinking. Also, interestingly, what's coming out is the decreased tolerance for risk, both at an individual, team, and organization level, because the barriers are increasing. And then one of the actually interesting things is the revised barriers to communication in both physical and virtual situations, both the positive aspects that are coming out, but also the very challenging aspects that are coming out. And then ultimately what's underlying this is a need for employee engagement, belonging, and positive retention. And I use that positive retention very intentionally, because in this very ambiguous work situation right now, there's a question of how do we positively retain people so we get both commitment and compliance, and not just compliance.
Lovely. Thank you, Terry. So we know psychological safety is important for individuals, for teams, and at this macro level. But what is it? Let's just explore that now. This is Amy Edmondson, and she coined the term 20 years ago, and she describes it as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. It's a permission for candor. It's something that is there to spur on healthy debate. And psychological safety is important for all sorts of situations. So if you're unable or unsure in terms of speaking up, particularly if it's a place of expertise, but you don't want to be the first person to speak up, then psychological safety is important there. If you want to admit a mistake that perhaps you've made, then of course psychological safety allows us to do that. If we work in a culture of psychological safety, if you want to share an idea but you're a bit embarrassed about it, or if you want to challenge somebody who's more senior than you, all of these things are enhanced and allowed through psychological safety, and it creates this this environment of constructive challenge, which at the moment within this very fast-paced world in which we live can become extremely important. It's particularly important for teams who have a high level of uncertainty and a lot of interdependence between team members. So it's important, I think, for us all at the moment. We asked the group to participate in a little poll a few days ago, and we said, how often do you say what you really want to say in meetings? And I'll give you the answer. Most people said two or three. Most often I say what I need to say. But we got into this interesting discussion, and even those people who were sort of scoring themselves a 1 and a 2 would say, well, usually at work when I can see people face to face and make eye contact, and I am quite comfortable speaking up. But in this strange virtual world in which we find ourselves at the moment, it's got to go down 1 or 2 points. I would feel a little bit less comfortable speaking up today whilst speaking from my home office to you across a screen. So this is something that we shouldn't take for granted. Psychological safety, even if you have it in a face-to-face environment, when you go virtual, it might not be quite there to the extent that you would wish it to be. Let's talk about interpersonal risk-taking at work. And this is fantastic. This is from Amy Edmondson's TED Talk. She made this joke that nobody comes into work wanting to look ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, negative, or irrelevant. We don't want those things for ourselves. And that's kind of cool because it's easy to manage. If you don't want to be those things, fine. If you don't want to be ignorant, don't ask questions. If you don't want to seem to be incompetent, then that's okay. Just don't admit weaknesses. If you don't want to be intrusive, then don't offer your ideas. If you don't want to sound cynical or negative, fine. Don't critique the status quo. Don't offer new ideas. And if you don't want to come across as irrelevant, then hold on, stay back, don't share information. I think, Terry, you had an interesting point to make here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when we look at this, there's such an individual cost to these behaviors, but also there's a real organization cost to these behaviors. So I work with a lot of private equity and portfolio companies. And one of the things that happens with a lack of psychological safety is it impedes decision making. And it can often hurt decision making in investment committee. Because at that point, people don't want to look ignorant or incompetent or negative or irrelevant. So people slow the decision making and they end up having sideways conversations. They end up navigating back channels, which both slows decision making but also undermines the credibility and the reliability of it. So on one hand, we all want to protect ourselves and we don't want to take the interpersonal risk. But again, to go back to the idea, the organization and the team costs are incredibly high when we don't have psychological safety.
Yeah. Yeah, and to the final point here, the not wanting to look irrelevant. Well, sometimes people can store information and hold their power by keeping information as well, and that's not great for teams in general. And there's something here that's quite interesting, a bit of a contradiction in a way. We're saying psychological safety is about speaking up and perhaps saying things which aren't comfortable. Surely that would lessen trust. Well, actually, we find it doesn't. So it increases trust. If I'm able to have an honest conversation about how I feel or give you honest feedback, it creates more trust than lessen it. And I want to just pick this final sentence from Amy Edmondson. She says, relying on team members to be courageous is not a strategy. Relying on team members to be courageous is not a strategy. We all have a part to play, particularly leaders of teams. We all have a part to play in creating an environment of psychological safety, so we don't see this reluctance to speak out or speak up. I'm going to share a few stories with you now just to make that point. Some examples of low psychological safety and not having that environment, well, unfortunately, they're quite plentiful, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So the behaviors that we see here undermine team and organizational performance, and let's get a few stories of that on the screen for you to look at. Now, the first one is Theranos. Anybody who has been listening to this wonderful podcast called The Dropout will know a little bit about Theranos. It was helmed by a lady called Elizabeth Holmes. Now, she believed she had this technology that, you could take a finger prick of blood and do analysis on it and find and diagnose a number of medical conditions just from a tiny pinprick of blood. This was a game-changing innovation. Unfortunately, the innovation was not real. Within this organization that she ran, she did not allow people to give her the messages that she needed to receive, that this technology did not work. Unfortunately, the culture within the organization meant that when people did say, look, I've got an honest truth to tell you here, this is not, these experiments are not going the way we hoped they would, those people were quickly quietened down. Their ideas were nullified and they were pushed to the side. The upshot of this is that the US Securities and Exchange Commission have now charged Theranos with fraud, and Elizabeth Holmes herself might be looking at 15 years of jail time. So in terms of ethical conduct, psychological safety is a massive advantage for an organization. And Terry, I think you're going to say a few words about Volkswagen.
Absolutely. In what is now called dieselgate, when Volkswagen installed some software that would falsify emissions readings when cars were tested. And it ultimately ended up impacting some 482,000 vehicles in the US. And again, the SEC fined the organization already $3.5 billion. And what's interesting, there were so many costs involved in this, not only the financial costs, but also the environmental costs, because the vehicles were emitting 40 times the emissions that they should have. But there's also a trust aspect. And initially, some of the senior leaders in the organization said, we didn't know about this. And if that's true, there's a massive issue of psychological safety that people didn't feel free to speak up. So either they knew or they didn't know, but either way, the reputational risk has been absolutely so damaging. And when we think about how do we create psychological safety, it is creating, again, that container of trust where people are free to say sometimes deeply uncomfortable truths.
Yeah. And let's look at a couple of examples now. We can create psychological safety. I'm going to start by giving you quite a wacky example to some degree. This was work that I did 15 years ago with a company called Lego Serious Play, and Lego Serious Play practitioners still exist, and they still do wonderful work around the world. And what we used to do is we used to get groups of senior leaders to build their strategy using Lego bricks, to use these Lego models as metaphors, to tell stories using little Lego figures. And you might now be raising your eyebrow thinking, well, how could that guarantee good decision making and insightful work? Well, we found that it did, actually, because it allowed people to almost take off this mask of professionalism and have honest conversations with each other. The use of humor as well was hugely important. Being able to laugh about some of the complexities of the work that we're doing is a wonderful way to free up the mind a little bit. People let go of their reputation management impulses a little bit more. And what we found is that if somebody is able to tell a story about this little figure, it is much more easy to tell that story than to be able to talk about myself. I'm able, within this light-hearted environment, to have very honest conversations about where this business is going. So really, the Lego wasn't the point. It was the quality of the conversations around these models and with each other. That's where some really good work took place. And Terry, you've been looking at some recent innovations that have been happening over the last couple of months due to COVID-19.
And what's fascinating is in this deeply uncertain time, there has emerged some wonderful pockets of psychological safety that has allowed a lot of innovation and collaboration. So the DIY COVID-19 solutions, and it is online open source design, and it was started as a Facebook group. And now it is really creating the most critical ventilators, masks, other equipment to go to frontline workers. And what's terrific in this is people created the psychological safety very quickly. They were able to cross both geographic and other boundaries, but they were able to harness this to drive impact immediately.
Yeah.
And it's removing the judgment that is so absolutely imperative.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been interesting is when we think about the involved in psychological safety, even at such an individual level. For example, even having online virtual calls, when you have a window into someone else's world, and there can be inequalities of how people are working, as team members really suspending the judgment of someone's spare bedroom or their home office, and really looking at this at an accepting level as opposed to a judgmental level.
Yeah, and it's been great as well to see people sharing their IP freely across the world as well. So we know that it can be powerful. We know that there are things that we can do as leaders to help create an environment of psychological safety. We did a bit of a poll with our groups, and we asked people if they really felt comfortable taking interpersonal risks and speaking out. Most people, we had a broad distribution of results here, but most people said, if I'm not the expert, I would prefer to stay quiet. And that's understandable. But one of the things we might say is that all of us has a contribution to make. And I think there's something about the team process where it's really important that we all at least are involved in decision making. I might not be the expert, but if I'm connecting with you, I'm giving you permission to tell me what you think, if you are the expert. So we have a responsibility to create dialogue within the group. So there can only be great things that happen when we do speak up and exchange ideas. Anyway, this was an interesting poll that we took, and we followed it up with a second poll, which was, well, what steps can you take to create psychological safety? And we picked up some really great suggestions from the group. But what we'd like to do is to just spend the last 10 minutes of this session today going through 5 tips that we know can help team leaders and team members create psychological safety in their teams. So let's do that now. These are our 5 tips for creating psychological safety. Role modeling vulnerability, listening with intent to understand, working on your facilitation skills, embracing conflict, and be willing to adjust your style. Let's take these one by one. So the first one is role modeling vulnerability. So acknowledge that when we don't have the answer, it might be okay to say that we don't have the answer. When we don't understand, it might be all right to say, I don't understand, or I've made a mistake. So acknowledge our humanity. Role model authenticity, role model vulnerability. Take this mask of perfection and professionalism off from time to time, which means that we can also share some of our discomfort, our anxieties or our fears, our weaknesses or shortcomings. We can share a little bit more of our true self. Now, I've noticed that in some of the meetings I've been involved in with some real intact teams that I've been working with over the last few weeks. So what's happened is that people have wanted to start these conversations by talking about how they're feeling right now. There's a lot of complexity and ambiguity at the moment. So discussing our anxieties and fears has been a really important part of the conversation. And I've noticed that we haven't been able to get further in terms of task and completion unless we do that. So we really do need to start where people are. Start with the emotions, start talking about our genuine feelings at this point in time. And then we might be better able to deal with the real projects and the real tasks as we work through the meeting.
Yeah, and to build on what Stuart is saying, taking that time to allow that personal connection, even at the beginning of a virtual meeting, at the beginning of the day, and creating these structured check-in points, it's incredibly valuable. And it's something that we can choose to take back to the new normal when lockdown is lifted. I know one of my current clients, they really struggle with psychological safety in their workforce. And what it means is they describe it as almost wearing a cloak to the office.
Mm.
And the financial impact of this has actually been massive because they have to pay about 30% higher in terms of compensation to get people to stay,
Yeah.
because it feels like there's only one way to be at that firm.
Yeah.
So it's something that we can practice in our very uncertain times right now. And then it's also the psychological safety is something we can choose to take back to the new normal when we finally do go back to work.
Yeah. Thank you. And this is all about what we can do for ourselves to help role model psychological safety. This step 2 is all about what we can do for others. So, a quick warning here before we move on: be yourself, but with skill. So this is a quote from Brené Brown. So we are telling you to be yourself, to be vulnerable, and to be open, but we also ask you to think about the impact of that as well. So think about your leadership role, and to be yourself but with skill. Some self-censorship might be called upon from time to time in order to create the environment that is most helpful. Tip number 2 is what you can do for others. So we talk about here the listen to understand versus listen to respond. Now, coaches have been telling us about this for a long time. Often we listen to somebody, but we're not really listening. We're thinking about our reply, our answer, or we're judging the quality of what they're saying. But actually, what we really should be doing is emptying our bubble, emptying our mind, and trying to listen to understand. So asking good open questions and pausing so that other people can really feel free to express themselves. That's hugely important for psychological safety. So it's just some tips here for you. If you want to listen to understand in a virtual environment, turn your video on. That can make a huge difference. So I can pick up on some of your nonverbal cues. Leave these long pauses so that other people who perhaps would be more reticent to speak up can feel they've got the space to speak up. You can introduce processes like doing a round robin, getting everybody to speak up one by one. That can be really useful. Or you can pick on people directly and ask them to contribute if you think that that's not going to be threatening to others. And another really good one, if you want to grab people in these virtual environments and really ensure that they're listening to each other, give them pre-work to do before the meeting so that everybody turns up prepared and we don't spend our meeting furiously looking through our notes trying to catch up. Tip number 3, work on your facilitation skills. And there are 4 types of facilitation. Facilitation number 1 is expert presenter. I speak, you listen. I've got 72 slides. Please just listen to me go through my slides. No questions. Slide number 2, facilitation style number 2, you get to ask me questions from time to time. Facilitation style number 3, I get to ask you questions and you get to ask me questions. So there's a bit of a dialogue, and you can see here the locus of control moving slightly more towards the group, and the control is given up by the facilitator a little bit. And number 4 is dialogic facilitation. This is where the facilitator almost becomes a team member. They are not the leader of the group anymore. Their job is to make sure that everybody is speaking to each other, connecting with each other. Now, if you want to create psychological safety, dialogic facilitation can be really useful. So in our virtual environment at the moment, trying to find ways to get individuals to connect with each other through Zoom or Adobe Connect, whatever technology you use, getting conversations sparking off between people, that's the holy grail. So let go of this need to control and to be in control.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Can help too.
And one of the interesting things about this, when we talk about facilitation skills, it's so contextually dependent. So one of the things that we spoke about on the webinar is when you create an amazing foundation of psychological safety, if you're using the interconnected way of the 4th method, this gives a foundation of trust so you can be more command and control if the situation warrants it. For example, I trained as avalanche search and rescue. And in those moments of critical decision making, it really was command and control. One person would say, this is what we have to do, and we need to go do it. By the way, you're hearing background noise of my psychologically safe family laughing in the background. So apologies for any of the background noise. So recognizing that these ways of communicating are very contextually dependent, but it's all with the idea of creating a foundation of trust.
Yeah, and I love that idea that because we did the psychologically safe, high trust work as a group beforehand, we then have the luxury to be able to be more control and command when we need to be in other contexts where that's required. Lovely. And so, you know, our fourth tip for you is to embrace conflict. And this is about normalizing honest feedback, being a leader that can role model giving honest feedback, exploring disagreements rather than running away from them. This can be particularly difficult at the moment in this virtual world, but it is worth spending time on. Showing appreciation for everybody's contribution. I may not agree with what you say, but thank you for speaking up. Being vigilant to small interpersonal complexities or challenges. I've written down here, distance multiplies dysfunction. There's a truth in that. So if there were interpersonal challenges between individuals when you're face to face, those little cracks can become huge chasms when we're in a virtual environment. So our leader role is one of vigilance, I think, when we're working virtually. Am I making sure that people really are getting on with each other and having respectful conversations with each other? Because it's much more risky in this virtual environment. And the final one here is the Abilene paradox. You may or may not have come across this. This is this idea where one person suggests something, they don't really mean what they say, but they suggest it just to fill in the embarrassing silence. And everybody goes, oh yeah, let's do that. And nobody really wants to do it. So, you know, let's drive to the coast. I didn't really want to drive to the coast, but I'm throwing it in there because what the hell? And everybody says, oh yeah, let's do that because we all think it's important to Stuart. He wants to do it. And actually Stuart doesn't really care. So be aware of the Abilene paradox. People agreeing on things just because it's easy to agree rather than really getting to grips with the topic and having those uncomfortable, protracted conversations, but doing it right. Finally, our final tip for you is to be willing to adjust your style. And this is kind of the message we've been trying to give across this whole presentation. This may be an opportunity for us to flex our leadership styles a little bit, to move from a place of curiosity and reflection, to practice patience and forgiveness when things aren't perfect. And things will not be perfect. We're in a new world at the moment, and things won't settle down for months to come. So let's be forgiving of each other. We have a colleague, Terry and I, who runs our virtual facilitation sessions from his home office. And he often has a cat walking along the bookshelf behind him, and occasionally the cat will plant himself on the back of the chair. And it's actually lovely. It's lovely to see a little bit of that professional mask come off and to see more of the person. So let's be patient and forgiving of each other. Show that vulnerability, be prepared to use more humor. And on a virtual environment, that can be more important than ever. And this idea of being empathic and honest as well, we mentioned it earlier, but spending the early parts of our meeting really trying to understand what is going on for people and how they feel emotionally might be a great way to ensure success for this team, not just in terms of the product, but also in terms of the process as well. Those are our 5 tips. And our final word.
And one of the things.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. One of the things that's interesting, if we go back one slide, Stuart, is the intentionality of this. To really think about, and it's something I've spoken with many of my clients, once we get to the other side of this lockdown, what do you want to be able to look back and say, I'm really proud of how I conducted myself, or I'm really proud of what my team accomplished, or I'm really proud of how I acted as a leader, because we have a choice in all of this. And we have this really difficult moment, and we have a choice of how we want to embrace it, how we want to help other people, and how we want to be as individuals, teams, and organizations. So with curiosity and reflection, patience and forgiveness, vulnerability and humor, and empathy and honesty, it's picking these areas out and thinking, which do I want to pursue with intentionality? So when we get to the other side of this, we can look back and really celebrate the success. Again, as Stuart was saying, not just the end product, but the process by how we got there.
Absolutely, and that links very nicely to our final word. And this was something that Terry and I spoke about when we were putting these slides together. There is an opportunity, I think, for teams to come out the other side of this being stronger than they were before. What it takes, though, is for us to be really careful about how we set up the way in which we communicate with each other and how we create this trusting environment. You know, when people go through challenges, people go to war and they come away having this profound sense of a band of comrades. At the moment, we're not in a time of war, but we are in a time of complexity and crisis, and we might come through this at the other end with potentially a more trusting environment, a more effective process for the team, and a better feeling for each other, our needs and what we want. So hopefully we'll come out of the other end of this with greater levels of psychological safety rather than not. And we would ask you to send us questions. So we have our email addresses just down here. If you have any questions about anything we've spoken about, please do use these email addresses and reach out to us directly. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And with that, I will stop sharing our screen, and I will say thank you very much for joining this recorded webinar. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. Thank you, and be well.
Thank you.